Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a set review for Historic 4 through the Omenpaths. So this is going to be the next set that drops on Arena. I believe it comes out on the 23rd, so only a few days to go till it comes out now. And this one's kind of confusing, so basically this is going to be the same as the Spider-Man set in paper, but because of a clash to do with digital card games, I think to do with Marvel Snap, they've basically had to rename all the cards for Arena and give them all new artwork. So it's going to be kind of confusing if you're someone who plays both Arena and paper, but as someone who just plays Arena, these are basically going to be what the cards look like that are on Arena. So what I'm going to do here is I've basically gone through the entire set, pulled any cards that I think are likely to see play in Historic, and I'm going to talk about their different homes and applications. Unfortunately, I don't think this set is as high power level as we've had recently, so there aren't going to be as many cards in here that are going to be Historic power level, and a lot of them are going to be more fringe stuff, maybe cards to look forward for the future, but there are still some cards that I do think are going to have a pretty big impact. So also we're getting a bonus sheet in this set, which brings us a few new to Arena cards that are quite iconic, like Ponder that you can see here. So I'm going to start off by talking about the bonus sheet cards, and then we'll move on to the main set as we go. So like I said, starting off, we're getting Ponder, and I'm not 100% sure on this one. They haven't announced that anything is going to be pre-banned from the bonus sheet yet, but I do think there's possibly a question mark over Ponder, because I think it's a very similar power level to Brainstorm, which is a card that is currently banned. So if I had to guess, I would assume that Ponder will be legal, and I am going to talk about it like it is, but I still think there's an off chance that it could potentially get pre-banned. But anyway, Ponder, I think this is just going to be the best cantrip that we have in Historic. Obviously, Brainstorm is banned, and there is maybe a question mark there whether Brainstorm is better than Ponder or not. But getting Ponder, we don't have any cantrips that are anywhere near as efficient as this. It basically gives you 4 looks at the top, which is a really big deal. So in terms of the decks that I think this could see play in, first of all, we obviously got Is It Wizards, which is a deck that wants to be running a number of 1-mana cantrips just to trigger your prowess creatures, help dig towards whatever you need. I think Ponder is just the best one that we've had out of those. I think the extra card selection is more valuable than consider, occasionally getting stuff into the graveyard. But I think the home I'm most excited for Ponder in is Lotus Field Combo, because Lotus Field Combo is a deck that really cares about finding specific pieces, both in terms of setting up. Obviously, you need your Lotus Field. Ideally, you want a Stifle and a Consign to go with it. Then you want to find Deserted Temple on top of that. And so Ponder in the early game, looking 4 deep to find those specific pieces is going to be absolutely huge. And then once you've got your things set up, Ponder is basically used as a combo extender to keep finding more untapped cards, keep finding more draw cards to ensure that you don't fizzle out when you're comboing. So I think Ponder is obviously going to be nice in sort of Is It cantrip style decks. If people are still playing Is It Phoenix, I think this will be an excellent card there as well. But I think the deck I'm most excited for is Lotus Field Combo. And since we recently got Crop Rotation, which I think is a huge buff in terms of both speed and consistency for a deck that I already consider to be pretty good, I think Lotus Field Combo is underplayed and generally undervalued, probably because, it's a difficult deck to pilot. It's quite unintuitive if you're not used to that sort of deck. And so I think after Ponder and after Crop Rotation, Lotus Field Combo is going to be one of the best decks in the format, in my opinion. I'm really excited to try it out myself. So yeah, Ponder, if it doesn't get banned, it's going to be a huge deal for those sorts of decks. Then next up we've got Terminate, which I think is just the best in slot for just 2-mana creature removal that we have access to. And I do think the ability to destroy bigger creatures is very relevant right now. I see a lot of the gen lists at the moment running Abrupt Decay, which I do think is good, being able to answer Goblin Bombardment, being able to answer the Mana Rocks, Utopia Sprawl against Eldrazi is pretty big as well. But specifically because of Eldrazi, I don't really like Abrupt Decay when the Eldrazi decks are casting really powerful 7-drops, for example. So having Terminate as a card that can still answer the cheaper creatures in the matchups where Abrupt Decay is good, but then can also kill the bigger creatures against decks like Eldrazi and Reanimator is a really big deal, I think. So Terminate, not sure it will see play as a 4 of depending on the configuration, but I do think in these sorts of Rakdos and Jund mid-range lists, specifically though, the Goyf lists that are seeing play right now, they'll really appreciate Terminate as a way to just have unconditional removal that's good against Eldrazi decks as well. Then next up we got Opposition Agent, which personally I think is much more viable in Timeless, because everyone's playing fetch lands there, so it's going to be good across the board, and you can obviously accelerate into it off Dark Ritual, which I think is really important with a card like this. You really want to get this down as early as possible, because, if the opponent uses their search effects in the first couple turns and you don't have this down, it just completely misses its value, if that makes sense. And because of that, I do think you really need to be running 1 mana Acceleration if you're going to run this in Historic, and I definitely wouldn't main deck it at all. You know, I think if you're going to run this, it's a sideboard card, and even though a lot of decks are running Search effects, I think Prismatic Vista is seeing more play right now than it has ever, basically, and also, obviously, the Eldrazi lists are running stuff like Sowing Mycospawn Spawn as well, but even with that, I don't think Opposition Agent is really good enough against the strongest parts of their deck anyway, so it wouldn't surprise me if this doesn't see play at all, but, you know, depending on how the metagame evolves, if a lot more decks do use Searching effects, then this seems like an interesting sideboard card in decks like Jund Goyfs, which are already running stuff like Ignoble Hierarch to accelerate into your 3-drops, but I thought it was worth mentioning this, but right now I don't really see this one being a big factor in Historic. The next up, another bonus sheet card in Tangle, which I wanted to highlight because I think it's just the best fog effect we're ever getting, right? Not only does it prevent the damage this turn, but it also kind of fogs the opponent's creatures for the next turn because they don't get to untap. So for 2 mana, this just seems like the best fog effects. Now, fog effects aren't played very often. I think the only decks that really play fog effects right now, I guess Orim's Chant is seeing play in a few kind of, you know, more fringe decks as well, but I have seen it play in Lotus Field sideboards like Orim's Chant there, and I think a lot of Lotus Field decks are going to be moving into green to get access to crop rotation and potentially Sylvan Scrying as well. So Tangle could be a really interesting sideboard card in those decks if you wanted to run those fog effects. And this just seems like 2 fogs in one, so if you are going to run it, this definitely seems like the best we've had in Historic at least. Then next up we got Saw in Half, which I don't think is a card that's going to see play right now. I don't think there's really a deck that wants to be running this, but it does seem kind of interesting as kind of like a combo card, right? You get a creature in play that has a really powerful ETB, then you can target it with Saw in Half, maybe in response to an opponent's removal, and then you get, you know, both the ETBs again. I don't really think there's a setup in Historic right now that's worth using this card, but I wanted to highlight it. It definitely seems like a card that I'm going to have at the back of my mind in case something in future kind of combos off with this, right? If you get 2 of the same creature in play, that can combo off, or maybe if you get 2 of the same ETB, that could allow you to do something really powerful. Right now, this doesn't seem worth it, but definitely one to bear in mind for future, I think. And same sort of thing with Winds of Change. Again, this is a card that isn't very good on its own, but, you know, say Orcish Bowmasters was unnerfed for whatever reason, or, you know, Shieldred, you know, works really well with other parts of your deck, then having, you know, a 1 mana wheel effect, it's not something we really have access to in Historic right now. We do have a number of wheels. We just got Memory Jar as well, which is obviously way more expensive, but if you are interested in this sort of effect and you do run a deck with a lot of cards that do punish the opponent for drawing, you know, whether that's Narset, Bowmasters, Shieldred, I don't think it's really worth it right now. I don't think Narset is particularly good right now. It's reasonable if your deck is good at running it, but there aren't many decks that can run Narset and are good against the rest of the metagame right now. Obviously, Orcish Bowmasters isn't worth running while it's nerfed, and, you know, Shielded isn't particularly played at the moment as well. So again, not a card that I expect to see play right now, but we haven't had a sort of wheel effect like this at this mana cost at the very least, so definitely one that I think is worth bearing in mind for future as well. So those are all the bonus sheet cards that I wanted to talk about. Next off, we'll have a look at the main set, starting off here with Merata Neuron Hacker, which is really interesting to me for affinity. So anytime we get a 1 mana blue legendary creature, always worth looking at because of Mox Amber specifically, and this one also just synergizes well with, you know, what artifact decks want to be doing. Now, the awkward thing about this is that most of the affinity cards or the artifacts in affinity are either really cheap, in which case you're probably just going to cast them. You don't need to use this to cheat them into play, or they're expensive affinity cards that are discounted by your affinity or improvise in the case of Kappa Cannoneer, in which case Merata is probably too slow to use them to cheat into play. However, the way I see, or the best way I can see using this, if you did want to run it in Affinity as maybe a 2-of, alongside Tamiyo and Emery in order to make your Mox Ambers more consistently, is if you invest your mana in card draw effects, like the clues from Tamiyo or Thoughtcast, and then you use Merata to put the artifacts that you draw into play. So I actually think using this alongside Tamiyo could be really interesting. So maybe turn 1 you go lands, Merata, Mox Amber, Tamiyo, and then every time you attack with the Tamiyo, you could just invest your mana into cracking your clues, which then puts more ingenuity counters on the Merata, and then, you know, if you're investing your mana into drawing off the clues, you don't have the mana available to then put artifacts into play, which you could then use Merata to put into play. So I do think that it does work reasonably well with some of the cards that Affinity are already running. Again, I don't think you want to be running it as a 4-of at all. 1 or 2-of probably alongside for Tamiyo, for Emery. And again, Affinity is a very tight list, so I think there's a chance this might not make the cut, but just more consistently putting Mox Amber online on turn 1 is very, very powerful. The curves where affinities start with Tamiyo, Amber, Emery are some of the strongest starts. So being able to go, Merata, Amber, Emery, or Merata, Amber, Tamiyo more consistently seems very powerful to me. So again, I don't think it's as powerful as the 2 legendary creatures that are already seeing play, but I think there's some crossover synergy, and I do think getting Amber online more consistently is a kind of a buff for Merata. Not to mention, I think the best builds of Affinity right now are the ones that can, set up Drix Interlacer plus Emery and then defend their boards. And, holding mana open for counterspells is another reason why you might want to use Merata to put your artifacts into play rather than casting them as well. So I think it's definitely worth trying in Affinity, and I wouldn't be surprised if this does end up being picked up as a 1 or 2 of in that sort of list. Then next up we've got Yera and Oski, Weaver and Guide, which is the first card we're going to look at with the in-web keyword, which is basically you can pay it, you can get it into play for cheaper if you return a tap creature to your hand. So if you do get this into play for 1 mana, it does seem very good to me. It's a 3/3, and then you look at the opponent's hand, choose a type other than creature, and then you get to basically just tax that entire type of card. So, if you're against Lotus Field, you get this into play, you look at their hand, you name sorcery, it basically just, taxes all of their combo cards, which is really good. So they won't be able to go off unless they have artist talent and discount stuff. Having said that, the fact you can't name creature does mean I don't think this is likely to see play in the main deck unless your whole deck is built around creatures with ETBs that you want to be able to reuse, like maybe Amps Raptor and stuff like that you only get the value off when you return it back to your hand. But having said that, I think there are better generic options for a deck like, Energy, which is the most common Amp Raptor deck right now. So I think, if you wanted to run a sideboard card against Lotus Field in Energy, this seems like a great choice if you don't mind losing Lurus, or if you're already running Flage instead with Gigantha. This seems like an interesting option. Outside of that, I don't think there are too many decks that gets really hosed by this. But having said that, I do think Lotus Field combo is going to be a pretty big deal going forward, assuming people are willing to pick it up. I still think right now it's a very underplayed deck because it's very difficult to play, or I guess more unintuitive than anything else. But this does seem like a pretty effective sideboard against them, and it's just good on rate, right? You get this in against control, name sorcery to hit their sweepers, or instant to hit their counter spells. So this is a pretty interesting one. I think it's more of a sideboard card, and again, I'm not sure it's really worth running right now, but definitely one to bear in mind for future. The next up, we've got Firebrain Scheme, which is a card I'm very excited for, specifically in Is It Wizards. So as I mentioned earlier, obviously Wizards is a deck that runs 1 mana cantrips to trigger their creatures. Now again, with Ponder coming out, I'm not sure that this is going to be better, just because looking so many cards deeper is really nice. But the thing that makes me think this could potentially be better than Ponder, specifically in Wizards, is the recent unnerfing to the Chorus package, or specifically to Ribbled Shanty, which by extension makes Hymn to the Ages playable again. Because I think right now in Wizards, the most powerful thing they can be doing is recasting Hymn to the Ages with Dreadhorde Arcanist, because that just gives them huge inevitability in the mid to late game, right? Even if you're up against a deck like Eldrazi that can get on the board and really start dominating things, if you can, draw 5-6 cards with Hymn to the Ages, you can set up these crazy turns where you get a bunch of creatures in play with haste, buff your board a massive amount, and just attack in even if the opponent has a big board. So I think with the Chorus package, Wizards has really good inevitability in longer games, and the fact that Firebrain Scheme works as a cantrip early on because of this effect. Now obviously, exiling the cards forces you to use them straight away, whereas Ponder and Consider, you can keep whatever card you get in your hand, which means that this is going to be quite awkward if you side into counter spells, whether that's Spell Pierce or Consign, because if you cast this on turn 1 or 2 and you hit a counter spell, it's kind of wasted. So there definitely is some tension with how Wizards decks are built at the moment. But the fact that you have the ability to also buff your Dreadhorde Arcanist to be able to recast Hymn to the Ages, or obviously, buffing 2 creatures can be the difference between setting up lethal or not, is really exciting to me. I think the more ways you have of buffing your Arcanist to recast Hymn to the Ages is pretty exciting. Now, having said that, the addition of Swift Spear's Teachings, which can give Dreadhorde Arcanist prowess, which incidentally allows it to buff itself, in addition to Symmetry Sage and stuff, maybe Wizards already has enough ways to do that, and, the quality of Ponder might just be too much for this card to see play. Where is it? Here we go. But I'm definitely going to be trying this out, and I do think, the flexibility of a cantrip that can also buff your creatures will help you set up lethal more often, especially the first strike is going to be useful if the board is kind of stalled as well. So again, I'm not 100% sure this is going to see play over Ponder, but it's definitely one to bear in mind, specifically if you're playing the Chorus package in Wizards right now. Then next up we got Wonderweave Aerlialist, which is a card I'm pretty excited for Boros Auras specifically. So I think if you're playing Mardu Auras, Juggernaut Peddler is definitely the 2-drop of choice to be running alongside Light Pause and Core Spirit Dancer. But more recently, I've been kind of interested in moving from Mardu back to Boros, largely because of Giver of Runes and because Eldrazi is still the best deck right now. So I think, in Auras, you really want to have 16 creatures that you're happy to put Auras on. So you obviously Esper Sentinel, Light Pause, and Core Spirit Dancer. Then in Mardu, you've got Juggernaut Peddler. And then in the past in Boros, usually seen either Amped Raptor or Hushbringer in that extra 2-drop slot. Giver of Runes and Thoughtseize, I always see as occupying the same slot because I don't think Giver of Runes is a creature that you're ever happy to put Auras on. It's kind of a way to protect your other creatures. So I kind of see it as the same slot as Thoughtseize in those decks. And more recently, I've been thinking that Giver of Runes is really important, specifically because Eldrazi is the best deck right now. Not only can it give your creatures protection from colorless, which helps you defend against Kozilek's command, but the fact that Eldrazi's creatures are all colorless also means that you can give your creature protection from colorless to just give it basically unblockable for the turn and allow you to attack in for lethal. And so if you're running Giver of Runes over Thoughtseize, I don't think it's worth splashing black just for Juggernaut Peddler, especially because a lot of decks are running, White Orchid Phantom, Field of Ruin, Ghost Quarter style effects, especially with the recent release of Exploration. I think Exploration plus Ice Till Explorer plus Ghost Quarter is going to be a package that more decks start experimenting with. And so running a deck with few basics is a bigger risk right now. And so for those two reasons, I do think it's, for me at least, much more interesting to be running straight Boros, get access to Giver of Runes, have a cleaner mana base where you can run more basics. But I do think the extra 2-drop slot in the straight Boros list is still a question mark. Obviously, we've seen Amped Raptor see play there in the past, and I think Amped Raptor is fine, but nothing amazing, right? It's inconsistent a lot of the time. Because ideally you want to go Raptor and then find a Spirit Dancer or a Light Pause, but if you go Raptor and find a 1-drop Aura, that's not that great. And then as a creature to put Auras on, obviously getting First Strike is nice, but past that is not anything to write home about. Hushbringer's obviously seen play in that slot in the past, and I do think how good Hushbringer is very dependent on the meta, and with Eldrazi being the most popular deck right now, and Hushbringer not doing much against them unless they're running the Faceless Agent Fleshraker build, I don't think it's really worth running Hushbringer in the main deck right now either. So there's definitely a question mark at the 2-drop slot in straight Boros Auras, and I do think Wonderweave Aerlialist is a contender for that slot. Obviously, double white mana is quite restrictive, but like I said, if you've moved back to Boros, one of the main reasons is for a cleaner mana base, so you should have double white the majority of the time anyway. I think if I'm building Boros right now, every land I'm putting in the deck is going to be producing white, so not going to be an issue there. And the fact it naturally has Ward 2 and then gains flying as soon as you put an aura on it is a huge deal. I think it's kind of reminiscent of Invisible Stalker, which is a card I've run in the past in auras. This was a while ago now, but the fact you can get a creature that has Ward 2 and flying naturally in the color combination that you're already in makes me think this could be worth running at the 2-drop slot. Naturally having protection, naturally having evasion is exactly what auras want, so definitely going to be trying this out in Boros Auras. Then next up we've got Giantcraft Helm, which is kind of an interesting equipment. Obviously the idea here is that you get it down on turn 1, and then if you're playing Affinity, all of your Thought Monitors and Kappa Cannoneers just instantly get this attached. If you're playing the warp creatures like Quantum Riddler, this immediately gets attached there as well. So, this could be an interesting option in Affinity. Again, I'm not 100% sure. I think Affinity is a very tight deck right now, and especially with the recent release of Drix Interlacer, I think Affinity is generally better if you run counter spells and then try and set up Interlacer plus Emery to just absolutely go over the top in terms of card advantage. But this is definitely an interesting option for decks that can run expensive creatures that become cheaper as part of your proactive game plan. So not one that I'm very optimistic will just go straight into the decks, but definitely one that's worth bearing in mind if you want to run a more aggressive build of those sorts of decks like Affinity. And then next we got Through the Omenpath, which is another Convoke payoff. Again, I feel like this is a card where the power level is potentially there, but I'm not sure the deck is really, because for this to be efficient, you want to be running a bunch of Convoke payoffs and then creatures that you want to cheat into play. Now, that's kind of awkward because for Through the Omenpath to be good, you want to be running just a big, generically powerful creature, which doesn't really fit very well in the Convoke shell, right? If that makes sense. Because you're going to end up with hands where you have a bunch of cheap creatures and then just an Atraxa or whatever, and that just doesn't do anything. So I think for this to be effective, you'd probably need to have generically powerful creatures that you can convoke into play, that you can also cheat into play off through the Omenpath, maybe like Buxton, but the issue is Buxton has been nerfed and the nerf carries over to Historic, so that's not really playable right now. So I think this isn't really playable right now with what we have, but if we get more convoke creatures in the vein of Buxton where their effect still happens even if you don't convoke them into play, right? Because the issue with using this to put a Knight Errant of Eos or a, Venerated Lockstone into play is you don't get any bonus of doing that because they affect the creatures that you convoke to get it into play, if that makes sense. So I think this is one that isn't really playable right now, but it's definitely on my radar if we get more convoke creatures like Buxton going forwards. Then next we've got Multiversal Passage, which is another interesting one. So this is going to be a very big one for Utopia Sprawl decks, I think, because Utopia Sprawl is one of the best 1-mana ramps that we've got access to in Historic right now, mainly just because it can't be killed by creature removal. It's much more resilient to early interaction, which is a big deal for your early ramp. You want your ramp to survive. But the issue with Utopia Sprawl, especially in Historic, where the only good fetch land we have is Prismatic Vista, is it does force you into pretty awkward mana bases where you just have to run a bunch of basic forests in your usually multicolored deck. And Multiversal Passage is nice because it now means that you can just replace some of those basic forests with a land that can produce multiple colors. Now, when I first read this, I was super excited because I thought that you can use this to name wastes, and then it's another way in Eldrazi to give you colorless on top of a land that can make green for Utopia Sprawl, or your off color, red if you're running the more aggressive build, or Stone Rain, and then blue if you're running the other builds with Null Drifter and stuff like that. But unfortunately, it's been pointed out to me that wastes is a basic land, but it's not a basic land type, so you can't name colorless for this. But I still think it's going to be useful in Utopia Sprawl decks as a land that can also produce your off color, means you're not forced to run a bunch of basic forests. Now again, the 2 life is a downside, so if you're running a Utopia Sprawl deck where you already have enough colors of your off color, which is definitely helped by Utopia Sprawl already, because obviously if you're running Gruul, you can go forest and then just name red on your Utopia Sprawl. So if you're not short on color fixing, then the downside of the 2 life might not be worth it on this. But especially if you're running a 3-color Utopia Sprawl deck, like maybe the Team of Battlecry deck, for example, or you just don't want to fill your deck with basic forests, this is definitely an alternative there. But outside of that, I don't really see many uses of this in Historic anyway. Then on the lands sub-theme, we've got exclusive Nightclub, which is very interesting because it's a land that we can kind of cheat into play by discarding it, so it turns your Faithless Looting into more value, if that makes sense. But these sorts of looting decks, having to run tap lands is pretty awkward. Obviously, if you play your land for turn from your hand, you can't Mayhem this into play. So I think this is an interesting card, but you want to be running this in like a value looting deck, and most looting decks are way more degenerate and fast, in which case you don't really want to be running tap lands in your deck. So if I don't think it has a great home right now, but if a looting deck that plays a bit of a longer game, maybe a control deck that has looting synergies, this is definitely interesting there. But it's the first land we've had of this where you can cheat it into play by discarding, so I definitely thought it was worth highlighting. And then next up we've got Urban Retreat, which is very interesting to me because it's basically a land that can ramp you if you have a tap creature in play. So if you go, turn 1 play a creature, turn 2 tap it for mana or attack, you can then use, return that creature back to your hand and then basically just put Urban Retreat into play and it accelerates you, which is pretty interesting. But again, it's a lot of hoops to jump through, and I think we already have better acceleration. Like, we just had Exploration added to the format, which is way more powerful. We've obviously got Utopia Sprawl, we've got Mana Dorks, we've got, 2 mana cards that can put lands into play that see basically no play right now. So I think this is interesting because it's a land that ramps, which we've not seen before, and that alone could be interesting. But again, we don't really have a Bant deck in Historic right now either, so this definitely strikes me as a card that I wouldn't be surprised if it sees play in future, but I can't really think of a good, top tier home for it in Historic right now, but definitely one to bear in mind, I think. And then next time we've got Skittering Kitten, moving on to the more fringe stuff right now, and this is basically just a slightly better version of, I think it's called Insolent Neonate, which is a card I have actually been testing recently because we recently got Life Death, which is a 2-mana reanimation spell, and obviously, we've got Persist in the format as well, and so outside of Faithless Looting, this and Insolent Neonate are the only other 1-mana cards that loot Obviously, we've got Artillery Enthusiast as well, but that doesn't work very well if you're putting reanimation targets in the graveyard because, say you're putting a 7 or 8 mana creature into the graveyard, Artillery Enthusiast will then just tutor you another reanimation target. You would much rather have these 1 mana reanimation ditchers draw you a card as well, right? Because you don't want another reanimation target if you've put one in the graveyard. So if you want to have redundancy for setting up a turn 2 persist or turn 2 life and death, past Faithless Looting, I think Skittering Kitten is just the next best option because, haste is more useful than Instant Neonate just not having anything. So again, not sure it's really worth it because it makes you more all-in on the reanimative game plan, which makes you more vulnerable to graveyard hate. And I don't think this is a particularly good standalone card. But if your deck is just super focused on setting up a turn 2 persist or life death, definitely worth considering. The next up we got Makdee and Itla Skysnarers, which is a pretty interesting sideboard card that, the fact it targets artifacts and creatures means it's going to be effective against both affinity, shutting down their Mox Ambers and mana sources, being able to be tapped the same turn, and then also stopping Drix Interlacer being popped the turn it comes down means that it's a fairly effective way of stopping them looping it with Emery. It basically just delays that loop by a turn cycle each time, which is kind of interesting. And then obviously the fact it stops, creatures with haste is kind of interesting as well. But again, I feel like there aren't that many creatures running haste, there aren't many historic decks right now running haste creatures. Obviously, there's Eldrazi with Linebreaker, but outside of that, the rest of their deck doesn't really care about their creatures entering tapped, really. And so, again, I'm not really sure this is worth running right now. I think if you wanted to hard target affinity, there are much better options, right? You've got Meltdown, Divine Purge, stuff like that, or Wrath of the Skies as well. Very, very good against affinity. So if you really want to be hard targeting affinity, I think there are better options right now. But say, Linebreaker decks start seeing more play everywhere, or a deck emerges that's full of haste creatures and you wanted a card that could target both, this is an interesting sideboard card. So again, I don't think this is likely to see play right now, but definitely one to bear in mind for future. Next up we got Quint's Insight, which again, another one I'm not sure has a great home right now, but it is very interesting. It gives you a loot every single turn, which is obviously going to be useful in any deck with graveyard synergies or, madness synergies, whatever, any deck that wants to be pitching stuff to the graveyard. And then it also has this effect kind of similar to Unstable Amulet, where it pings every time you cast a card from anywhere than your hand, which is pretty interesting because it doubles up as a value card that also works as a finisher. If you're playing Underworld Breach and you're casting stuff from the graveyard, this could be a really good way to just ping the opponent without needing to wish for a win condition, for example. So I think the main power level of this card is from this part. It works as a finisher that also provides value in setting up. So again, I'm not sure it has a great home right now, but this is definitely an interesting combination, and it wouldn't surprise me if this sees play as like the finisher in a deck that is, I don't know, running Breach as a finisher, or just has a way to repeatedly cast spells from your graveyard or wherever. The next up we got Spectral Restitching. Again, another card that I think has a pretty high ceiling but just doesn't have a good deck right now. Obviously, you could maybe run this in an Affinity deck with lots of ETBs, but Affinity, all of the good cards with ETBs are already self-contained good cards anyway. I don't think you need to run this on top of Thought Monitors and other artifacts with ETBs to make those decks good. So again, I think this is one that I'm going to have in my mind for future, but I don't think it really has a great home right now. And then finally, we've got the Terminus of Return, which is a pretty interesting card. It's a black mana rock. It enters untapped, which is a really big deal. I think one of the main reasons why the Talismans have seen a lot of play recently is because they enter untapped and they can produce coloured mana, as opposed to something like Mindstone, where it's kind of difficult to use the extra mana the same turn you cast it, which is usually going to be turn 2. Whereas this, you cast it on turn 2, you got black mana available for something like Thoughtseize or Fatal Push, which is a lot more useful than colourless mana. But then it's got Indestructible as well, which is nice against the majority of artifact removal that's being played in Historic right now. And it has a pretty effective mana sink at the top end as well. I think one of the issues with the Talismans is that they do nothing once they're in play, as opposed to something like a Mindstone or a Terminus of Return that actually gives you a good mana sink later in the game. It being legendary does mean that you probably don't ever want to be running more than one or two of, but it does have a pretty, if the game is very grinding, goes on and you can activate this, it will just start taking over the game. So I do think, as mana rocks go, if you're playing black, this is just by far the best one that we've got access to. Unfortunately, I don't think there are many ramp decks that want to be running black right now, but, if you are in black and you do want to have acceleration, I think this is going to be especially useful in Alchemy and Standard, where we don't have as many, mana rocks like this. In Historic, I think if you're running Black, this is the best one, but Black Ramp isn't really a big deal right now. It's not really a big deck at the moment, if that makes sense. So anyway, those are all the cards I want to talk about. Like I said, I think overall, for Historic and Timeless anyway, this isn't as powerful as some sets that we've got recently, but I still think there's some, definitely high impact cards in here. Obviously, Ponder, I think if this isn't pre-banned, is going to be the most high impact one, but, we've got some useful cards that could see play in Affinity. I think Wizards, this could be an interesting card to play there. Wonderweave Aerlialist seems like it could be a nightmare to play against, especially if you're running an interactive deck. Maybe this, if it does see play in Borosaurus, will be a reason to continue running Abrupt Decay over something like Terminate to bypass the ward on it. But yeah, some interesting cards. I don't think there's going to be too many that completely shake up the format outside of something like Ponder. But either way, I'm very excited to get my hands on these cards and at least try testing them out. Definitely let me know in the comments if you think there's any cards from the set that I didn't mention that you think could have historic applications, because as always, there's a lot of cards, there's a lot of potential interactions to think about, and I'm sure there's some stuff that I've missed, so definitely let me know in the comments. Also, let me know if you think there's any applications of these cards that I didn't talk about, because again, the historic has such a big card pool. I'm sure there's some cool interactions with cards that I'm not thinking about with these. Also, let me know if there's any specific decks you're thinking of brewing once the set drops, because I've got a list of stuff that I'm really excited to try out. Speaking of which, if you're an MTG Zone Premium member, I recently posted an article with 5 Theorycraft decks. Actually, it's 6 if you include a deck with Ponder. Basically, pre-existing historic decks that potentially improve with some of these new cards like Ponder and Lotus Field, like Firebrain Scheme in Wizards, for example. So if you're an MTG Zone Premium member, I'll have a link to that article down in the description. But either way, once this set drops, I've got a ton of brews that I'm excited to try out. Hopefully we'll have video deck guides if those brews end up being good. Even if they're not, I might cover them in Under the Meta, we'll see. But either way, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Big up!